Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope that you could hear me. So we're having a student internship panel where students from the department speak about their summer experiences. Right now, we have 4 speakers, starting with myself, Kyra, Jisun, and Margalit. So I hope you really enjoy this. If you have any questions, please let us know or write it in the chat. And we'll try to answer your questions and give you advice that we think is useful when looking for an internship. Okay, I hope you could see this. So my name is Coral de Mar. I'm a senior at Hunter. I am majoring in environmental studies and Hispanic literature, and I'm minoring in anthropology. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my summer experience. It was very interesting. So me finally choosing what to study. Let's start with a little bit of background. I come from the University of Puerto Rico, where I started by studying biology. But then after Hurricane Maria, I transferred to Hunter, where I started studying Hispanic literature. But my interest was always partly in environmental studies. That's when I decided to do a double major. So other groups that I'm a part of are the SEEDS ESA chapter, which we'll talk a bit about later. I'm part of the pre-law program, Young Professionals in Energy. I'm a Jacqueline Schiller Scholar. I'm a Sigma Delta Pi in Spanish Club president. I'm vice chair of the Ecological Society of America student section, and I'm part of the Hunter Sustainability Council. And I bolded those that you guys could join too if you're interested, because they're the environmental sector. So what I did was an RU, and an RU means a research experience for undergrads, and it's usually sponsored by the National Science Foundation. This is a good opportunity for network, for experience, to get to know yourself, what you like, what you don't like, and those professional interests. I found out about this RU through SEEDS. SEEDS is a group within the ESA that focuses on diversifying the field of ecology and environmental sciences. So what I did, I worked with Harvard Forest for the whole summer, and I was working under Dr. Jonathan Thompson, and his lab is focused on land use disturbances over long periods of time. So the LTER Lab means long-term ecological research lab. I focus on anthropogenic disturbance, specifically the role of invasive insects on overall forest carbon. And I used a model called Landis-2 to simulate forest growth, response, and its implication on carbon. And basically through this RU, I self-taught myself basics on GIS in order to do a good job. So here's my poster, and I'll give you a little bit of a rundown about what I did. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is committed to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And this is in part by relying on forest carbon sequestration. So as you all know, trees sequester carbon, and when a lot of public policy and people in government try to plan their sustainability goals, they rely a lot on their natural areas and spaces. But there's this risk which is enhanced by globalization, which are invasive forest insects and pests. And these are pests that come through timber that's being sent to different states. And this basically eats native trees, therefore affecting the overall carbon budget. So it is very uncertain on how invasive forest insects affect this goal of reaching net zero carbon by 2050. So my study objective was to estimate the risk to forest carbon from 3 insects and their impacts on their host trees. So the Asian longhorn beetle, it usually eats red maples. The emerald ash borer eats white ash, and the hemlock woolly adelgid usually eats hemlock trees. Another thing that's a risk to overall forest carbon is timber harvesting. So if you are a landowner and you see a really weird bug at your backyard, you probably think it's just going to eat away all your trees. So in order to mitigate the risk, a lot of people, what they do is that they take all the merchantable trees rather than just the ones that are infested. That way they could make a profit. So basically what I did is that I integrated data on forest development dynamics, defoliation response, forest management, and climate change into this model that simulates forest growth. And these simulations span from the year 2010 to 2050. And I also expanded it to 2105. This was all throughout Massachusetts. You can see my little study area map here. And then I did 9 runs where I modeled 3 scenarios per species. One was no insects, which is the control, the infestation, and then salvage logging after initial infestation. And then I estimated the impact on above ground carbon, and I compared carbon stocks within the infestation and logging scenarios. So basically, my main takeaways were that after infestation, there is an overall reduction to carbon stocks, and meaning that insects do affect overall carbon sequestration in the forest. And I also found out that logging usually exacerbates overall carbon in short terms, but it does allow more growing space for trees. So in the 100-year landscape, it allows for more growth. So it kind of averages out. So this allowed me to grow a lot professionally, discover that my passion is forestry and ecological research. And after that, I participated at a national symposium where I presented to a lot of college level students and professionals. And then I participated at a midterm review for the NSF. And right now, currently, I am doing my capstone with the Harvard Forest Long-Term Ecological Research Team. Basically, on something similar to what I did during the summer, but instead of focusing on carbon, I'm focusing on overall species composition and diversity. So after that, I did a New Mexico Institute with the National Hispanic Environmental Council, where they basically paid me to be 10 days in New Mexico and learn about a lot about the overall ecology and a lot of careers that I could follow or pursue in New Mexico. Some places I went to were Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Pecos Riverway. And through this, I went to USDA research areas, and I was able to see the New Mexican forest. I was able to see the desert, and I was able to see long-term agricultural research going on live. So basically, here is an example of what I did. I learned to take soil cores and estimate the length of a tree. I also did a bar plot on estimating how much biodiversity there is in an area. I learned a lot about native practices in the area. For example, this tree over here. Oh, sorry. This tree over here is a quaking aspen, and indigenous communities use the bark as sunblock, which was extremely curious. The picture at the upper right is Chihuahuan from like Mexican cattle that people are using now in New Mexico because they require less materials in order to sustain them, and they last longer in these very desertic areas. So there I am doing what people do. Another thing, I saw a coyote for the first time. I went to Pecos and Santa Fe National Forest. I have never been to the Western US area, so that for me was very exciting. I met a lot of professionals. I did some electrofishing and I measured some fish biodiversity. I was able to see some indigenous architecture and meet a lot of new friends from diverse areas. And I was able to see in the top right, you could see me smiling with two older people. They are my family members who I hadn't seen in over 10 years. So overall, the end is like, I was able to go to visit this place, learn about their ecology, and also see my family. So it was a great experience overall. And there I am carving a fish, which almost fell. And that's it for me. If you guys have any questions about my project, what I did, or how you guys can find out about opportunities like this, you could let me know. I can put my email in the chat and you could, I don't know, send me an email and we could set up a meeting or something.
Hello, my name is Kyra Procopio. I am an environmental studies major. I'm a senior graduating in the spring. And this summer, I did a pathways internship with the Physical Sciences Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado under NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of what exactly I did, and then I'm going to be able to show you guys the video that I made with my mentor. So the Physical Sciences Laboratory, PSL, went on a pretty important expedition to the Arctic for an entire year. And for that, they used this technology that they built on site that would help, that records the surface fluxes and everything that has to do with the surface energy budget. And it was a very big project. The expedition, it was international with 19 other countries, well, 19 total countries, including the US. And I was able to create this video that I can now have on my resume as a tangible thing that is, I think, very unique to have on my resume. So I'm going to share my screen and show you guys what it is. Okay. Oops. One second, wrong one. Okay, so this is the webpage that I also helped make. It's basically just a rundown of what the video is. And right here is the video. I hope that you guys can all see it. And I'm just gonna let it play.
My name is Matthew Shoup.
It's Chris Cox.
Amy Solomon.
Michael Gallagher.
Sarah Morris.
Neil Utah.
Ula Person.
Dave Costa.
Leanna Nixon.
Jackson Osborne.
The ASFS is the Atmospheric Surface Flux Station. And these stations that we built are stations with the intent of measuring all components of the surface energy budget. And so these stations measure the radiative components of the surface energy budget, the turbulent, sensible, and latent heat flux components, and the conductive heat flux through the sea ice.
The reason why the surface energy budget is so important is because it tells you how the atmospheric processes are interacting with the sea ice. They're basically, if that energy budget is positive, then you're either raising its temperature or you're actually melting it.
MOSAiC, the multidisciplinary drifting observatory for the study of Arctic climate, was an international research expedition to study the Arctic climate system. Beginning in fall 2019, the icebreaker called Polar Stern drifted in Arctic sea ice for over a year and served as an intensive observatory, allowing scientists to collect data in every season. Surrounding the ship was a distributed network of key measurements that would capture information on spatial variability that will contribute to model improvements, sea ice forecasting, and weather and climate prediction.
It's really incredible that this MOSAiC campaign was as successful as it was. There were so many challenges, not just from COVID, which was huge in terms of transport was not available, that they were relying on to provide new crew to and from the ship. But also there was a very strong polar vortex, and the near surface winds were much stronger than they had anticipated. And so the ship was drifting much faster than they had anticipated.
The PSL research team started assembling the first ASFS in early summer 2019 in Boulder, Colorado. That particular summer, there was a heat wave in June, and the team was forced to build the ASFS in 100-degree heat while navigating challenges for a system that would function in -40 Arctic temperatures. The team finished building 3 ASFS by the end of July 2019.
We developed it specifically for MOSAiC, from a napkin doodle in October 2018 or whatever it was to the 3 finished products that were shipped in July of 2019. We didn't have the opportunity to go to the Arctic and test them ahead of time. So again, yeah, I try to build in some flexibility so that you can adapt the system to its environment when you get there.
The methanol fuel cells were definitely a concern. We didn't know how they were going to perform during the winter months. There was some cold testing before shipping everything off to Germany, but there were still some questions about how these systems would actually perform in the Arctic.
The communications was a big problem that we had to solve because some of these instruments were going to be further away from the ship than a normal radio signal could reach. So we chose to go with Iridium satellite communication that would transmit the data to satellites and bring it back down to the ship so we could continually have contact with each instrument while it was out there.
To develop the ASFS, we had to pull from our entire team here at PSL, and that included engineers, researchers, meteorologists, experts in IT and communication, logistics managers, communication teams. We had to build these in-house from nothing, and so there were a lot of factors at play, and it took a village to get these things off the ground.
The deployment of the systems was, in a word, pretty fast, right? So we left Tromsø in September 20th, I think the ships left, and we were back in late October, but the actual deployment of the distributed network only lasted about a week. So the first system went out to the site L1 on October 5th, the second one to L2 on October 7th, and then the third one to L3 on October 10th.
We had been out to visit a station a couple days prior, and then, here we are back at the ship, and this station went offline. We just lost communication with the station altogether. And it turns out there was a little bump in the system. So we figured, something that's about 3 times as big as us must have bumped this. And so at the time I was like, I bet a polar bear was there messing with our system, because that would be right about the right amount of energy, if you will, of pushing on the system. You could tell a polar bear swiped it, damaged some cables, and bent a few things. And so it was actually really interesting to try to put together the pieces of that puzzle to kind of remotely diagnose what might have happened.
There was this particular event where there had been 2 storms that happened in a row. So the first storm actually killed one of our 3 remote stations where we take weather data out much, much further from Polar Stern. And so we're walking around in the darkness with our headlamps and the helicopter, and we're like, where is this? And we look and we look and we look. The short version of the story is after the 16 hours, we broke it all free. We set up a whole rigging system where we orchestrated these pulleys and these points so that we could pull it out without breaking it more. We were able to get it out of the ice, and we were able to set it up and to assess it. And actually, somehow, not much was broken. There was a few instruments that were broken, but we had spares for those specific instruments. All of the important stuff was not broken through pure luck. And turns out the real end of the story is Chris Cox was able to come out when the sun had come up on the next leg to go out with a helicopter to pick it up and to save it and to rescue it. And it actually took data all the way until the end of MOSAiC, which was fantastic. It was, you know, it ended up being one of the last surviving pieces of equipment, and we got 7 more months of data out of it.
The polar stern icebreaker was forced to leave the MOSAiC ice floe to resupply crew, personnel, fuel, and provisions. Due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, all previously scheduled resupply vessels were docked. Scientists and crew on board the polar stern quickly hatched a plan to leave the scientific equipment on the ice in hopes that it would continuously collect data while they were away. The ASFS was one of the only pieces of equipment that was able to successfully collect data during this time.
We just didn't have any other alternatives at the time because there were no other vessels available. Travel was very difficult. And so we unfortunately had to bring the ship out of the sea ice, and this was not part of the plan. Fortunately, we had these ASFS stations, and we could leave one behind at the primary MOSAiC ice floe, the one that we've been following for the whole year and monitoring all this changes. We could leave an ASFS right there on the middle of that floe, even as the ship left, to monitor all the details of how this transition towards the melt season played out, in spite of the fact that we, the people and the ship, were actually gone at the time. So, you know, this is a huge success story for these ASFS stations.
During Leg 4, the ice floe had dissolved into open water, marking an unprecedented early melt season that was not expected. The participants of Leg 5 were tasked with rebuilding the MOSAiC research camps onto a completely new ice floe that they hoped would last the rest of the summer.
We had to set up a new floe, and part of setting up that new observatory where we could take instruments after the old floe had been destroyed because it had moved more quickly than was expected. We had to take all of the old equipment and rebuild something completely from scratch.
At this new ice floe, the meteorological tower was reconstructed with 2 ASFS located nearby for additional spatial information. By reinstalling the tower and ASFS on the new ice floe, the team could ensure that there would not be a gap in the meteorological data record, despite the unexpected degradation of the original ice floe.
The ASFSs were very successful. I think maybe particularly I feel like they were really designed, and the place where they really shone was during Leg 2, because to try to get a surface energy balance over the Arctic ice pack in the wintertime is an enormous challenge, and there are very, very few data sets that exist like that.
You know, it really does take a laboratory like PSL to do bigger things like this, bigger projects that take a long time to develop and that require all these different skills. And so, you know, ASFS, I think, really does highlight some of the great cross-cutting strengths that we have at PSL.
The greatest challenge is yet to come, and that is to take all this data and actually make sense of it and to actually answer questions with all this data.
Okay, so that was the video that I made with the help of my mentor, Sarah Morris. She was the first one listed in the credits. I think it's an incredibly unique sort of internship project that I was able to do. And it gave me the ability to speak to everyone from all parts of the PSL lab, the Physical Sciences Lab. and sort of see everyone's role in it. And it gave me great opportunities. I'm still working with NOAA as part-time, still as a federal employee, and I will continue to be working there so far as I know after I graduate. So I think this was a really valuable experience for me, and I'm really glad that I was able to, I'm glad that I had the privilege of being able to do this and to work with the people that I worked with. So that's it. The next person who is going to be presenting, give me 1 second. Oops. It's going to be Jisun Reiner talking about the sustainable management of glass eel resources under the global expansion of aquaculture.
Thank you, Kyra. That was an awesome presentation, and Coral too. I really enjoyed hearing about your guys' experience, and so nice to be here with you all. Like Kyra said, my name is Jisun, and it's nice to see everyone here today. I am a senior at Hunter in the Environmental Studies Department and also Sociology Department. And this summer, I did research at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which, if you don't know, is one of the leading oceanographic institutions in the world. So it was a really awesome experience. Most of it was conducted virtually, but we did get a week at Woods Hole, which was such a great experience, and I will speak about all of that shortly. But yeah, I wanted to share some of my research that I did over the summer, which was all about eels. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Yes, on the side you can see the good old life cycle of the eel. I was working in the Marine Policy Center, which was a really cool like intersection between the sciences and the policy stuff of science and oceanography. And my research was focused on anguillid eels, which are eels of the genus Anguilla. They are freshwater eels. And there are 3 main types of eels. There's Japanese eels, European eels, and American eels. So I'll give you a little eel crash course because I think it's pretty relevant and also pretty cool. Because there's a whole mystery of how eels are born. We actually only know vaguely that specifically European eels and American eels are born somewhere in the Sargasso Sea, but we still haven't been able to specifically locate where they are actually spawned. So we haven't seen an eel spawn in the wild. And people have been searching for centuries. I read some literature of like Sigmund Freud, like before he got into psychology, he was actually an eel biologist and was trying to find out where eels were born, and we still haven't found out. So that's pretty central to the story of my research, because the fact that we haven't been able to see them spawn means that we aren't able to breed eels in captivity. So we rely on harvesting eels from the wild, and growing consumer demand for eels has meant that we are catching more and more eels from the wild, and globally eel populations are declining. So my research was basically looking at the drivers of eel population decline and demand, and see how those drivers inform this rise in eel aquaculture. And I, all in hopes to just figure out what it means for sustainable eel harvest. And I was also specifically focusing on glass eels, which is the life cycle of the eel when they're traveling from the sea to freshwater. And a lot of times fishers who catch eels will catch eels in their glass eel stage, because then they can take these baby glass eels and then raise them in captivity in eel farms. So I will show you my poster. This is basically a whole little overview of what I did. I introduced my subject. I performed a whole literature review where I talked about the background, like what I just kind of expressed to you guys. And I used a biological model on MATLAB to try to find out or to simulate how different fishing management scenarios would affect eel populations in the future. So you can see the results of these simulations here, and the top simulation here is kind of the most telling of the story, because it's basically, this top simulation is saying that if we completely restrict fishing eels in any stage of their life, they will still take about 60 years to go back to historical pre-1970s populations, because the 1970s is kind of when we see this huge surge of eel demand. And that just speaks to the difficulty of repopulating species and how it is a very tricky subject when you're trying to research and come up with a whole suggestions for sustainable harvesting, because you can't completely restrict eels, and even if you did, it would still take 60 years for the eels to come back. So yeah, I also was just, as I said, looking at the different economic drivers and searching how the eel market has moved throughout the years. So you can see here this increase in aquaculture, which is again farming eels, glass eels in captivity, and then a decline in captured eel fisheries. And the captured eel fisheries is basically the adult eels. You can also see this huge surge in eel harvest in Maine in the second figure here, because as eel populations decline globally, American eels are being really sought after, and Maine is one of the only places where you can fish for glass eels legally. So my whole program, it was conducted for 11 weeks, and I was doing the research for about 10, with 1 week in there for the going to Woods Hole experience. But there's still a lot of work to be done. Further research of my study could consider the different life stages of the eels. And also, I think that there's a lot that we need to do research on about the different eel biology between European eels and American eels specifically. But yeah, my main conclusion was that basically we'll need to restrict at least 90% of eel fishing if we'd like to see populations spring back to the pre-1970s population. But that, of course, is going to require a lot of conversations with different communities and fishers, and you know, it's not exactly feasible to just completely entirely restrict eels, because they are really important to a lot of different cultures as food and even as like a spiritual symbol. So yeah, that was a bit about my research. Just a very quick overview, but I'll talk a little bit more about my experience at Woods Hole, which again was it was so amazing, and I definitely recommend going to Woods Hole if anyone is ever curious about oceanography. There's a whole like really rich history of oceanography there. So here are some pictures of the institution itself and some of the people that I was with. We saw all of the big technological things that they do, and here on the right is the Alvin sphere. Alvin is a deep sea submersible, and basically 3 people fit in that small little metal sphere and they go deep down in the ocean. So it was really cool getting to see that in real life. And yeah, just getting to see all the different departments. There's 5 main departments at Woods Hole, and we got to just check out each one of them and all the different technologies that they use. And here are some more experiential things we got to do. We took a look at all the different boats that they have. We went on a field trip to a salt marsh and saw all of the different organisms that live there. We took a lot of different sunset swims and had a really nice bonfire by the beach. So it was just a lovely time to get to, like, I don't know, be with each other. But definitely one of the most, I feel like, life-changing experiences that I had was getting to go out onto the research vessel called the Tioga, and we got to actually spend a whole day out on a cruise and deploy different oceanographic equipment stuff. So here is a picture of the Tioga. That's the boat that we were on for a whole day. And here is the picture of me and my friend doing what's called a Van Veen grab. You basically like put that in the ocean and it grabs a ton of sediment that you just put in a bucket, and then you can sift around and see all the different organisms you catch. Down here is also, it was a really cool thing. We took a sediment core And it was really awesome. You could like feel all the different textures of mud in there, to just like, and that is descriptive of the age of the mud. We also went to Martha's Vineyard, a popular island destination, and we went fossil hunting there and saw some really cool museums. And we also swam with bioluminescent phytoplankton, and that was awesome. You could just like go into the water and see all the phytoplankton sparking up as you were swimming in the dark. So it was a really fun experience. In typical years, when before COVID, and probably now after this year, usually the whole summer is in person. But for me and the year before me, it was mostly conducted virtually because of COVID. But it was still really awesome getting to go to the institution and getting to conduct my research. So I highly recommend any chance you get to go there or apply for the Summer Student Fellowship, which is the specific name of the program that I was in. It is open for juniors who are interested in this field. So yeah, thanks for listening to my presentation. Any questions you might have, I'm happy to answer. I went through it pretty quickly, but yeah, definitely if you are also interested in applying to the program, feel free to reach out to me. Cool. And if there are no questions, okay, I can pass it along to our next presenter, Margalit, and she is going to be talking about, sorry, one second. Margalit was in the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program at Washington University, and she's going to be talking about Vaccinium Response to forest fires in Western Cascadia. So I will pass it along to her.
Hello. Let's see. I will share my screen. All right. One second. Okay. So, can everyone hear me? See my screen? Good. Okay. So last summer, the past 2 summers, I was with the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars. I don't know if anyone has heard of this program before, but it's a 2-summer program that they have a couple different locations, and I was with the one at UW. We had usually a cohort is about 20 people, but since complications with COVID happened, we kind of got smushed into what we called the mega cohort. So this picture here is most of the people from 2 different cohorts. And so just like a quick overview of what the Doris Duke program is about. This is just directly from their website, and they're mostly about promoting biocultural conservation. They're very focused on including humans in this idea of conservation and the interactions between humans and all other species, as well as non-biological communities. And the first summer, what we did was it's usually supposed to be in person in Washington to gain a kind of place-based understanding of the area. And we were online for our summer, but we basically analyzed intersections of biodiversity conservation, cultural identities, and environmental justice, and learned from like a variety of conservation practitioners in all these different disciplines. And the second summer, which is what I will be talking about most, we did actually get to go to Washington, and we were part of different internships and different projects and came up with our own research. So here's just more than a couple pictures to kind of get an idea of what we would have been doing the first summer, which is really to go to all of these different ecosystems, because Washington has a whole variety of crazy places. It's mostly coniferous trees that grow there. and these big mountains, that's Mount Rainier, up on the top there and in the middle. And once you go up into the top of the mountains, even though this was like the middle of summer, there's just a crazy amount of snow. There's a picture of me on the top just with like a 6-foot wall of snow at the top of the mountain. And there's also the Hoh rainforest that has these huge deciduous trees and these epiphytes and crazy hanging mosses that you can see in the corner. There are sandy beaches, there are rocky beaches, and it's just a really cool conglomerate of ecosystems. And this picture of the onion looking things in the bucket is actually camas, and me and some of my internship people went to a different internship site where we helped the Swinomish tribe gather camas, which is like a traditional cultural food that was planted in prairies and ended up not kind of going out of practice for a while and is now hoping to get back into practice. And here are a bunch of pictures from my fieldwork experience. So this is when I was working with Washington University. And basically the point of our research here was to gather data about how the forests in the Western Cascades respond to fire. And we worked on these really crazy steep slopes that you can see in these pictures. At the bottom left-hand corner, that's me and my internship partner Davian, that were both from DDCSP working with UW, and you see the rest of the field crew who is mostly people from the university there. And we basically set up these huge plots using transects with a bunch of smaller subplots to measure different woody debris and understory species. And just to give, I guess, a brief overview of the kind of data we collected, for the trees, we collected mostly their species, their DBH, canopy cover. We used laser rangefinders to figure out heights of trees and heights to different points of the canopy. We collected data on dead trees and woody debris. And that's important, especially because the data that we were collecting is all about how forests respond to fire. And these woody debris gave us some information about like fuels and how that could contribute to future fires. And then we also looked at the understory plants. We looked at woody shrubs, which ended up being my interest because I decided to look into the Vaccinium species, which are huckleberries, which is a woody shrub. And we also looked at the herbaceous species and tree cotyledons. And we also looked at burn forests and to collect burn severity. And there's a couple pictures of those burn forests in this slide. And also just to give an idea for just like the height of these trees here, I included this picture of, I think it was a noble fir that we had to measure in one of the forests that was just incredibly huge. And we would go out, me and Davian would go out to the forest every other week. We would stay there for a week, we'd be camping. And then on the weeks that we wouldn't be doing the field work, we would be collecting data from literature reviews and conducting informational interviews so that we could learn about indigenous methods of land management and the use of fire. And we collected data from these interviews and from the literature to make a table with information about a lot of different things about cultural burning, like the location and topography of cultural burning in the Pacific Northwest, the different groups that did the burning, the frequency and intensity of the burns, and also the purposes of the burns. And we found that the main purpose of the burns was to manage food plants, like berries and roots that grow well in prairies and open forests, and also to facilitate hunting and create trails and a couple other purposes. And with that info, Davian created an interactive map on QGIS, and I decided to kind of combine the post-fire fieldwork that we were doing with the literature review about indigenous fire practices to examine the post-fire vaccinium presence in the Western Cascades. And Vaccinium is huckleberries, or includes huckleberries, and here is a picture of one of them. So to go over a little bit about that. So huckleberries are a very important traditional food and medicine, and used for subsistence and cultural purposes by many indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest. We specifically were working with the Tulalip tribes in the Pacific Northwest through a tribal liaison. And so Vaccinium membranaceum, which is Black Mountain huckleberry, was one of the most sought after species. It had these huge berries, very sweet, and they were eaten, harvested, and then dried. And these huckleberries are still being stewarded and harvested, but because of the colonial practices of fire suppression, and also not allowing indigenous people to steward the forest any longer, in most places, berries started dying back because they grow really well in open forests with a lot of light, which the indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest kind of facilitated using fire. So that's going away now. So they'd have these frequent low severity burns, which kind of got rid of tree cover and allowed light to get through to the understories. And on the western side of the Cascades, there hasn't been so much opportunity to research how huckleberry responds to wildfires, particularly because wildfires on the Western Cascades aren't as frequent because of the humid environment there. So since there were some more recent fires lately, we took this as an opportunity to be able to kind of see like how these species might react to fire, even though it's been many decades since cultural fire practices were used. So in the research, we particularly looked at these 4 gradients of interest. We looked at warm versus cold forest zones. We looked at hill slope position, stand age, and burn severity. And I will not go through every one of them, but just a brief overview, I guess. In the forest zones, we typically found that Vaccinium were in the colder forest zones, which are typically correlated with higher elevations. And that aligns with the cultivation practices that were used in higher elevations of burning. And that's also, this data here about the hill slope position also contributed to that. We found that the highest percent cover Vaccinium is at the ridgetop, followed by then the mid slope and upper third of the slope. It was difficult to draw like real conclusions from this because we didn't have enough sample data on the ridgetop area, but even still, Vaccinium abundance seems so far to be slightly higher on the upper parts of the slope rather than closer to the valley bottom, which could be for a lot of environmental reasons, because ridgetops are typically a less productive site for trees. So there's usually more available growing space and light availability, which is really helpful for huckleberries. And fire management, in the literature, we found that a lot of fire management occurred higher up in the mountains. And we hypothesized that this could be because fires travel upslope more quickly than they go downslope. So it's a lot easier to control fires that are closer to a ridgetop rather than a valley bottom. And in terms of stand age, we found that huckleberries were much more abundant in the young stands, which makes sense because of the need for Vaccinium to get this like enough light coming through the canopy. And these stands were about 40 to 50 years old. They were in the process where there was a little bit more light availability still fairly open. And they were actually mostly created through human disturbance of being cut for timber. And skip over that. And we also found that there was a bit of a higher percentage of Vaccinium cover in higher severity burns, which could be because of the ability of these higher severity burns to clear out more canopy. Even though in the past, indigenous burns for huckleberry management were typically low severity, these burns would have happened very frequently, you know, at least every few years. So a low severity fire that occurs now, which is a pretty rare occurrence, might not have that same clearing impact. So what we basically overall found is that huckleberries appear to be more prevalent at the higher elevations, at ridgetops, in early sterile environments, and after a fire that would open up the canopy and reduce competition. And this was important to look at also the human background here, since harvesting wood and quickly replanting trees was occurring in this area. And this could have created an early sterile environment if there wasn't so much pesticide use and other factors. And skipping this, we thought that this could be relevant in terms of current huckleberry management and restoration policies that are being carried out by indigenous communities, because currently fire is still not used so much, but another way that people are kind of stimulating this clearing of the area is by cutting down shrubs and cutting down trees to kind of create this prairie-like or open woods environment. And that would avoid the shading of huckleberries. So we thought that that could be an interesting thing to continue working on. And yeah, so like I was saying before, there were some limitations because this was only data collected during one field season. And obviously with these kind of forest experiments, we need really like decades of data. So this is really only a very preliminary exploration of the data that's going to be continued to be collected. But yeah, it was really interesting to do this work and to be out in the field, really like getting an understanding of how this data is collected and then being able to do some analysis of it as well. So yeah, hopefully we gave this information to the Tulalip tribes in hopes that we can continue stewarding. All right, that's it. Thank you. If anyone has any questions. And also for the program, GDCSP, I believe applications are still open. It's really cool. It's open, I think, to freshmen and sophomores because of that 2-year program, but you should look into it. All right. I don't know if there's anyone else that's presenting, or if we're done now. Anyone else here that knows?
I think you're all done with the presenters. I don't see Coral on anymore, but Kyra's here. Hi, Kyra. And you're part of the Seeds group, right? Okay. I guess all of you are part of Seeds. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about what Seeds is for those in the room who don't know about your group yet.
I don't think that I am in the Seeds group, but if somebody else wants to talk about it.
I can jump in quickly. Seeds is one of the environmental clubs here at Hunter. Coral is the president, but it stands for, it's a long acronym, Sustainability Education, Margalit, do you remember? Diversity. Oh, Students for Ecological Education, Diversity, and Sustainability. There we go. It is a mouthful, but it is basically a club for the purpose of making ecology more inclusive and diverse. And we host, yes, thanks, Chloe. And Chloe, if you want to jump in, please feel free. But we run different environmental events or discussions. We had a few volunteer events as well, but basically the whole purpose of Seeds is to get people from all over. You don't even have to be an environmental science student, but just people involved in talking about nature, in being in nature. And we hope to have different field trips and stuff outside as well. But that's the whole mission, is to make ecology more inclusive and just a safe space for us to talk about different environmental things or just get to know each other, build a network. So that is the club, and we meet on Wednesdays, usually at 3 o'clock on the 10th floor. Today was a little different because of this event, but if you're ever in school on Wednesdays at 3, please feel free to swing by. We usually have, we have an event pretty much every week. So that's a bit about Seeds. And if I think that's the end of the event. Those are the presenters. So I will just say thank you to everyone for coming out here and for listening to all of our research. It means a lot, and hope to see you around sometime.